Can Fabiano Caruana stay perfect against Hans Niemann? He's already won 3 games with the black pieces out of 3 classical games. Can he continue that winning streak against the spirited Niemann? Let's dive right into this game. Fabiano's playing white, Hans is playing black, and we have a Ruy Lopez. This is called the Berlin defense by Niemann. It's a staple in many Grandmaster repertoires from the black side. And here both d3 and castle are equal in popularity. And d3 was played in the game, keeps more pieces on the board. So I think this shows that either Fabiano wants to play for the win, or he wants to avoid Hans Niemann's preparation in the castling lines where the queens come off the board. Bishop c5, bishop takes c6. This is a modern way of playing the position. It gets us into sort of a Ruy Lopez exchange variation now, where black has the doubled pawns, but he also has the bishop pair, and white has a bishop and knight. Pawn to h3. Move 6, a rare move by Fabiano already, but he did play this against Jordan van Foreest earlier this year in a rapid event. Knight d7. Hans spends 6 minutes on this move, so that means he's probably out of his main preparation for this game. Knight to c3, quickly played by Caruana, so he's still in his prep, and we're following only 8 games. Nihal Sarin and Alireza Firouzja have played this same position from the white side, which is interesting. Castle, bishop to e3, and this is the first deep think by Fabiano. And the idea here is he wants to offer the bishop trade. And you'll see throughout this game that Fabiano is very comfortable taking this into an endgame against Hans. So now bishop to d6, castle, and we're sort of transposing into a bunch of different Ruy Lopez games. Now it's transposed into a Caruana versus Hou Yifan game in 2017. Rook e8, knight d2, and now we've left the Hou Yifan game and it's transposed to Caruana versus Aroni in 2015. So you can tell that Fabiano really knows his way around these positions because so many of these games of his are showing up even with different move orders. Knight f8, knight c4. So now we got to think about imbalances here. We know that Hans has the bishop pair, but we now have this tension. The knight on c4 attacks the bishop on d6. So Fabiano can play knight takes d6 really at any moment because the bishop doesn't want to leave the defense of the pawn on e5. So that tension favors white a little bit. Knight to g6, pawn to d4, Fabi strikes in the center. Bishop e6, and here the knight is being attacked. So Hans is saying, okay, you have to make a decision with this tension. Are you going to take that bishop on d6 or retreat your knight? And knight takes d6 played by Fabiano, an excellent move, the best move in the position. And here, queen takes d6 would leave Hans with a bad pawn structure. And then those double pawns will start to come into play. So instead, he plays the better option, c takes d6. The problem with this is now he's in just a little bit of a passive position. Compare these pawns to the pawns that Fabiano has. Fabiano just has a little bit more space, and now this pawn tension favors Fabiano. And that's because black doesn't really want to take, just gives an extra center pawn for Fabiano on the 4th rank, and there's no 5th rank pawns for Hans. But he doesn't really want to sit there either, whereas Fabiano gets the choice to sit, take, or push. So that pawn tension favors Fabiano. And he decides here to play d5, which is an interesting choice. So he doesn't keep that tension. And here what we're going to see is a clash of styles. Caruana is trying to keep the game simple, just grabbing space, going for an endgame with a slight advantage. And Hans is not able to play his usual wild and attacking style that we're known to see out of Hans. So Hans plays c takes d, knight takes back by Fabiano, and look at this beautiful outpost square for the knight on d5. The knight is touching all of these squares, just controls everything from the center, and that knight cannot be kicked by a pawn. So here, if bishop takes d5 is played, for example, trying to eliminate the knight, queen takes d5, this favors white. It's a super low risk position, really easy to play, and Fabiano can simply pile up on this weak pawn on d6, and the c pawn can always go to c3, so that's not a weakness. So that'd be a super easy, comfortable position for white. Hans did not want to go into that. So after knight takes d5, he plays queen to d7, queen d3. Now bishop takes d5, And he must have figured that Fabiano costing an extra move to play there was worthwhile, or he had calculated that he would be able to play d5. And I think that's actually probably the latter, because look what happens in the game. Queen takes d5, the knight attacks the queen retreats, and now an immediate d5 by Hans. He gets rid of his backward pawn. So that's why he took in that situation. He knew that in a couple moves he could just play d5, get rid of the backward pawn. E takes d, queen takes d, and now the queens stare at each other down the d file, but which queen is going to blink first? This is something that it's a good takeaway for you guys to remember. When two equal value pieces attack each other, like the two queens here, usually on average, it's better to let the opponent take you and you recapture with the piece. It's better to let the opponent initiate an equal trade. It's not always the case, but it's a good general rule. And a lot of players are quick to just make the trade right away, simplify. But you want to back up your piece, let them take you. So now we see the same thing out of Hans. Queen e2, queen a5, queen g4, a hint of aggression from Caruana. Is he going to take Hans to endgame school, though? As soon as one more set of pieces come off, technically we're in the endgame. The way you know it's the endgame is if you have less than 7 pieces on the board. That's kind of a general rule. And right now, if we count the pieces, there's 4 for white, 4 for black. So we got 8. So technically, we're still in middle game territory. But the threat here after queen g4 is rook sinking down to d7. And there's only one good move for black. Hans needs to find queen c7. And it's a hard move to find because there's so many options here. The position almost looks drawish. It looks kind of boring and dry. I'm not sure if that's what got Hans, but he plays queen to a6. This is a blunder. He must have miscalculated the following sequence, and Fabiano sees it. Rook takes d8 check, best move. Rook takes back. Rook to d1, that's the critical move. Now, if rook takes d1 is played, queen takes d1, threatening to come down to d8, and also threatening to come down to d7 if black guards d8. And this is a really strong position for white. It's already a +3 or +4 stockfish advantage. And black is going to lose at least one pawn here. So after rook d1, rook a8 was played by Hans. And now rook to d7. And here's the point. The rook slices along the 7th rank. Very valuable to have your rook there. And Hans Niemann's rook is stuck on a8. Knight g6, queen to f3, threatening queen takes f7, which is going to lead to a checkmate, and also creating a double attack on this weak pawn on b7. Now, Hans here gets a little bit greedy. He snags this pawn on a2. And at first glance, this makes a lot of sense. The queen comes back to guard f7. So he's winning a pawn and defending at the same time. But Fabiano has a cool move here. And if you watched our last video, there was a move similar to this, trapping in the opponent's piece from getting back to the defense. Pawn to b3. This queen cannot come back to defend. So it's trying to box out the queen. Essentially, Caruana's pawn is the no entry sign to Niemann's queen. So now knight h8 played. Oh, what an ugly square. The knight sits in the corner just to guard f7. You want to play active in endgames. We just did a ChessGoals live lesson on this on the YouTube channel. One of our key takeaways is play active in endgames. This is way too passive for Hans, and it's going to come back to backfire. Queen takes b7, attacking the rook, picking up a pawn. Material is balanced, but the activity is in Caruana's favor. So rook e8, queen c6, and now rook takes a7 as a threat, and the rook on e8 is hanging. Hans needs to make room for his king, so he just decides, I'm going to play h6. I'm not going to fall for a back rank mate. Rook takes a7 played. Caruana collects the a pawn, has these two connected pass pawns that are ready to sprint down the board. Also in our in-game lesson that we did on the ChessGoals channel, we had a quote, passed pawns pose problems. That's the case here. The two passed pawns for Fabiano push up the board, become extremely strong. Queen b1 check, king h2, rook f8. And at this point, Fabi's king is very safe. Hans's king is very safe. But look at the piece activity. Fabi's pieces are all better placed, and we already talked about fast pawns. Queen c4, preparing to play b4, so the queen is helping to defend the pawn, and she also keeps an eye on f7 and keeps c2 defended. Perfect square for the queen. Rook d8, pawn b4, rook to b8, creating a double attack on this pawn. Hans wants to get active, but it's hard when you're playing Caruana from a worse position in the endgame. Pawn to c3 played simple chess, shoring up this pawn on b4. Rook d8. Now queen to a2. Fabiano shows off by saying this endgame is winning. Even after the queen trade, you better retreat your queen, Hans. And he does. Queen back to e4. Pawn to b5. This pawn is rolling very quickly up the board. Where does the counterplay come from for black? King h7, b6, f5. Good attempt. He wants to play f4. Queen to a4, another queen trade offer. Hans must be really frustrated at this point. Every queen trade offer is winning for Fabiano. So he retreats his queen down to b1. And now we see queen to h4 hitting the rook. And Fabi shows he can play aggressively too. This queen is just lingering around the black king. Rook to d6 played. Queen e7, threatening checkmate and threatening the rook simultaneously. Rook g6 to defend both. Queen takes e5 played. Hans Niemann resigns. The computer says at high depths this is a mate in 14 moves with best play. So checkmate in 14 for Caruana. Fabiano increases his dominance over Hans. 4 classical games, 4 wins for Fabiano. Super impressive stuff. And Caruana's moves really just speak for themselves here. I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, guys.